So my remarks now are going to talk a little bit about why people have such a confused view of conservatism, and also why it is that the wrong kind, the imitation kind, the sort of fiat money version of conservatism, based around George W. Bush and people like him, has been so successful, while the authentic Ron Paul kind, the Pat Buchanan kind, has oftentimes not been as successful as it deserves to be. Americans, for the first 100 years or so, did not consider themselves to be conservatives or liberals or progressives. You had, lots of differences within the country. You had Hamiltonians and Jeffersonians, but people generally felt enough loyalty to the Constitution that nobody really styled themselves as a progressive who wanted to scrap or go beyond the Constitution or update the Constitution. People were generally quite happy for the first 100 years with the Constitution as we had it. And obviously there were problems, but there were also, this underlying sense that what the Founding Fathers had did was legitimate and was, a framework from which we could move on. It was really only in the sort of late part of the 19th century and then the early part of the 20th century that you began to have the word conservative come into use. And a lot of the people who brought the word conservative into the public discourse were actually progressives and leftists who wanted to use the word conservative as an insult. Because the progressives believed that we had to amend the Constitution, we had to, sort of short-circuit the Constitution, go beyond it, use judges instead of using constitutional amendments. These progressives considered anyone who opposed their agenda to be a conservative. And that introduces a confusion right from the beginning. This is back in the sort of early part of the 20th century. Because on the one hand, progressives were being opposed by people who supported big business. And so it was easy for progressives to say, well, conservative is just a word for whoever supports big business. But progressives were also being opposed by people who support the Constitution. And in fact, the confusion arises because some people think that conservative means just a supporter of whatever big business wants to do against little business and against individuals, whereas in fact, real conservatism has always meant not a defense of whatever the rich happen to want to do, but a defense of the framework of freedom, the Constitution, that allows people to become wealthy in the first place. So right there from the beginning, we see a lot of confusion in the beginning of the 20th century about the nature of conservatism. In the 1930s, you, of course, have what amounts to a revolution right here in the United States. Franklin Roosevelt comes into office. The country's in, a very bad situation as a result of Federal Reserve policies in the decades leading up to the Great Depression. And so Franklin Roosevelt comes in and he wants to basically concentrate all power in the White House. He wants to really revolutionize the Constitution. He tries to cartelize the economy with the National Recovery Act. He tries to, he actually does issue an executive order which confiscates all monetary gold. Monetary gold, after that point, is basically outlawed just by decree of the president. It's a dictatorial measure. It's not something that really has a foundation in legislation. It's just the president's will. And of course, Franklin Roosevelt also wanted to expand American power abroad. It wasn't just that he wanted to fight, evil Germans and evil Japanese. No, he actually wanted to create a kind of Anglo-American empire between the British and the Americans. There were always more elements in play than people realize. The people who opposed Franklin Roosevelt's effort to concentrate all power in his own hands, again, came to be called conservatives. And some of these people were, radical libertarians even, like the writer Albert J. Nock. But because they were trying to defend the old America, the constitutional America, the America of freedom and of doing your own thing, against Franklin Delano Roosevelt's attempts to centralize the country and turn it into a consolidated empire, the word conservative became appropriate. At a time when the Constitution was not endangered, people didn't so much have to think of themselves as conservatives. At a time when the Constitution was in dire danger, thanks to the New Deal, it was vitally important that people have that sense of themselves as conserving a patrimony that had come down to them and that was now jeopardized. Well, if that's what conservatism sort of started out as in the 1930s, as this very wonderful decentralist movement based in individual rights, it's kind of mysterious that by the 1970s we wind up with something radically different calling itself conservatism. Conservatives had opposed Franklin Delano Roosevelt's power grabs. But in the 1970s, a president who had been put in power in part thanks to conservative votes, Richard Nixon, was in fact doing many of the things that conservatives had opposed Franklin Roosevelt for doing. So for example, in the early 1970s, Nixon imposed wage and price controls. In 1971, he severed the last links between the dollar and the price of gold. And that was in fact what prompted Ron Paul to get into politics in the first place. Richard Nixon was doing, many of these things. He was consolidating power in the executive branch. He was waging unconstitutional wars, undeclared wars, not only in Vietnam, but also in Laos and Cambodia. And yet, for some reason, this was someone that conservatives had helped to get into power, and this was someone who, still claimed a degree of conservative support right until the very end. Well, what accounts for this? How did conservatives go from the 1930s, when they had a relatively little amount of power and a very great amount of principle, to the 1970s, when a lot of conservatives were supporting Nixon and had kind of lost sight of their own principles, even though they now had some access to the corridors of power, especially in the White House? Well, basically a few things had intervened. The big one being the formation of what's called the conservative movement. And that really gets started in the late 1950s and early 1960s. And it starts out very well. You had a fellow who was sort of the Jan Michelson of the 1950s and the early 1960s. He was a fellow by the name of Clarence Mannion. And he was a great constitutional conservative. And he was very unhappy with not only Harry Truman and Franklin Roosevelt and what the Democrats had done to create the welfare state. He was also very unhappy with the fact that the Eisenhower administration and Vice President Nixon had basically supported the welfare state, that they had given a Republican seal of approval to everything that the Democrats had hitherto done to damage the Constitution. So Mannion wanted to find a candidate out there who could reclaim the Constitution, who could represent a true conservatism, and that could resist both the sort of Eisenhower-Nixon kind of Republicans, the country club Republicans, and also who could reject Harry Truman and Franklin Roosevelt and what they had done to our country. So he wound up looking around the political scene, and he sees Barry Goldwater in Arizona. And he realizes, this guy may not be perfect, but he certainly represents a genuine effort to restrain the state, a genuine effort to get back to a more constitutional form of government. So Clarence Mannion worked very hard in 1959 and 1960 to draft Barry Goldwater to run in the 1960 presidential race. He wanted him to defeat Nixon for the Republican nomination, and then he wanted Goldwater to go on and become president. Well, Goldwater was a very reluctant candidate. He really didn't want to run in 1960. He didn't really even want to run in 1964 when he finally did. But he kind of quietly allowed Mannion and other conservatives at the grassroots level to push forth his candidacy. It fell short. He wasn't able to get the Republican nomination, and he didn't even get the vice presidential nomination. But that effort, that attempt by grassroots conservatives and by Clarence Mannion and a lot of people who were outside of the Beltway and who were just speaking for Middle America, that attempt to kind of create a conservative movement actually paid dividends, even though it did not succeed in nominating Barry Goldwater in 1960. Because what it did is it created a grassroots network and a system that allowed other forms of organization to grow out of the presidential campaign. So, for example, the students who had been supporting Barry Goldwater in 1960 subsequently formed an organization called Young Americans for Freedom in the fall of 1960. And that would then become a sort of nerve center that helped push forward further conservative campaigns. And what happened was that so much grassroots organizing came out of the Barry Goldwater unsuccessful 1960 campaign that by 1964, Goldwater was able to run again, and this time he actually did get the Republican nomination. And you can see a lot of parallels between what happened then and what's happening with the Ron Paul movement right now. Ron Paul was not able to get the Republican nomination in 2008, but as a result of his campaign and all the grassroots energy that came behind it, we now have a number of wonderful organizations that are fighting for a principled kind of constitutional conservatism. We have, of course, the Campaign for Liberty. We have Young Americans for Liberty, and just a variety of other groups which are doing everything they can to build a new movement that will actually get a principled conservatism into power.